Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. YouTube.com, search Bloomberg Podcast. Policy changes. A lot of folks are highlighting the financial services industry to benefit from a lot of policy changes. The absolute author on all of the Bloomberg Intelligence work on this is Nathan Dean, Senior Policy Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Nathan, I know you guys have gamed this out. You've kind of looked at financial industry, some of the regulations that it's dealing with now and that are still kind of on the table. What do you think here with what we're seeing here with the elections?
Yeah, so, with the financial services industry, it all came down to this rule called the Basel III Endgame. As outlined by the Fed, you're talking about a 9% increase for the G-SIBs, the Bank of America, JP Morgans, if you will, about 3 to 4% in terms of the regional banks. Now, with President Trump winning, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is likely going to flip on day one of next year. So this rule is effectively indefinitely delayed. You would need the Fed, the OCC, and the FDIC to move forward. Now, we think a 30% chance of it being finalized by 2026. The reason why we're not down to zero is because there is potential out there that a Republican-led regulator may try and move forth with it, but the idea is going to be completely different, and they're going to essentially start from scratch. So if you're talking about capital requirements on a global scale, remember, the European banks have already implemented their version of this. There could be some questions here on if the Americans aren't going to do this, why should the Europeans on the same side? So certainly a lot to play here in terms of the deregulatory efforts amongst the investment banks.
Nathan Dean, you are the consummate Washington insider. When I need to get my what-ifs answered about what's happening in Washington, I call you. So I have a question here. What names should I be looking at more closely than others? Bill Ackman, Elon Musk, Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick. I mean, talk to us about what the potential for a Trump cabinet may very well look like.
Yeah, so, obviously the big question here is, you going to get the Wall Street President Trump, or are you going to get a populist President Trump? And that's the question that I don't think anybody really has an answer to, because, for example, at the SEC, you have Commissioner Hester Peirce, who I think would be a very popular SEC chair coming from more of the conservative wing, the populist side of the party. But then there's also going to be folks like former Jay Clayton, obviously his name's been in there for Treasury, but, somebody like a disciple, if you will, of Commissioner or Chairman Clayton could be also named at the SEC. So the question that we have, and we should find out about this more over the next few weeks, is, are you going to get the populist Trump or the Wall Street Trump? And I think you're probably going to get a combination of the both, where if President Trump cares about your issue in terms of he specifically wants to be involved, you'll get a populist Trump. If it's something where he's happy to delegate to other folks in Washington, then I think you may get a Wall Street Trump.
Well, Nathan, it took a long time for Trump to pick his cabinet and his players back the first time around. Apparently, he's much more prepared this time. Talk to us about timing around some of those selections. When can we expect to hear something there?
Yeah, so I think you're going to hear it probably within the next few weeks. I mean, to your point, they've been talking about this for some time. But I would also note that the Republicans have somewhere between 52, potentially as much as 56 seats in the Senate. And as a result, the Republican Senate is going to be able to confirm a lot of President Trump's appointees on a much quicker basis than if you were to have a Democrat-controlled Senate or even a 50 or 51. Now, why do we care about this? Well, because the faster that those regulatory leaders come in place, the faster they can start these deregulatory efforts. A regulatory leader, for the most part, can't just come in and say, right, this regulation, we're going to just completely roll it back on day one. It's going to take 9 months, 12 months, if not even 2 years to move forth on that effort. So the quicker those regulatory leaders come in place, the quicker the deregulatory effort can take place.
Red headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal. Harris to deliver remarks at Howard University at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So we will have more reporting on that. Nathan, is President-elect Trump, is he a lame duck president? Is that a fair way to look at it?
No, so generally, and I say this generally, in the second term of a presidential term, if you will, think President Obama or President George W. Bush, you usually have about 18 months to expend your political capital. First 100 days of the presidency is critical. But as soon as Congress begins to think about their midterm elections, and then as the result, when they come back, why should they stick their necks out for the president who's going to be gone? So what do presidents tend to do? They tend to go internationally and they tend to travel because the power of the presidency is more powerful there. So, we do think President Trump is going to be spending a lot of time abroad. Ukraine, Middle East, for example, China. There's a lot of stuff that he can do there, but I wouldn't call him a lame duck just yet because, again, the power of the presidency is more powerful there.
Nathan, it took till 10:32 a.m. Eastern time this morning for China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to congratulate President-elect Donald Trump. You know that China tariffs are coming. You're a betting man. What kind of tariff regime do you think we're entering into? Is it going to be that 10% broad? Is it going to be 60% on China? What are you hearing?
So this is where I think the process of tariff is key. Now, remember, let's just say January 20th, president comes in, you see a red line over the terminal, you say President Trump signs an executive order saying tariffs are coming. In the language of that executive order, however, I think you'll see language that says the tariff is not coming for 270 days or 365 days. Why? Because tariffs are negotiation tools. President Trump doesn't know what the reciprocal tariff on China from China would be, and President Trump wants to use this as a negotiation. So I think there's going to be language in there allowing flexibility, allowing President Trump to come back and say, maybe not 60%, maybe we'll go to 10% because China gave us a win or something like that. So what we're saying is watch out for that headline risk in the first or second quarter of next year, but then you're going to get probably 6 months to actually truly understand what that tariff will look like before it goes into fruition.
All right, Nathan. As always, thank you very much for your analysis. Nathan Dean, Senior Policy Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. You can find all of Nathan's research at BIGO on the terminal. He really boils down some of this very difficult policy minutia into something that real people can understand and use.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. All right, we've got a Republican in the White House, got a Republican Senate, and the House is yet to be determined. What does it mean for policy? Our next guest has got some thoughts here. Ed Mills, Managing Director and Washington Policy Analyst for Raymond James. Ed, okay, it's kind of a red wave. The House is still to be determined. Now what? What policies should we expect from a second Trump administration?
So I think one of the questions we've been answering for folks here at Raymond James is, what is different this year from 2016? So first and foremost, Trump did not expect to win in 2016 and didn't have a transition team. That's not true this time. He's going to have a lot more personnel to start off, a playbook that they've been developing to implement. And so I do anticipate a lot of robust policies to start off 2025. That's on taxes, on tariffs, on trade, on immigration. Now, to get taxes done, you probably need the House of Representatives. As we're speaking right now, it's starting to inch towards that complete sweep, and Republicans are slightly better positioned to have a majority in the House than Democrats. But there's a big difference between having a majority and being able to govern.
Ed Mills, I'm looking at the S&P. We're up 2% on the day, led by the financial sector, the banks, 4.7% on the day. We are up. Talk to us about financial regulation under a Trump administration. I mean, is Barr going to step down? Who's going to replace Powell at the Fed? I mean, who's going to be controlling the Fed here? I mean, we know deregulation is good for the banking sector. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, Damian, you mentioned the two people that probably are the only ones that stay. With a Trump victory here, every single federal financial regulator will lose his or her job. This is the largest transition in U.S. history. This has become some court cases in the last couple of administrations because of precedent. But we've been in what I've described as a regulatory supercycle. We've talked about higher capital standards for big banks following the bank crisis last year and the implementation of what's known as Basel III capital standards. The regulators came out with new restrictive merger guidance in September. Throw all of that out the window with the Trump victory. And so that's what financials are reacting to. Not only are their capital standards not going to get higher, we could see significant regulatory relief because there is a deregulatory bent, and we're probably likely to see a considerable amount of consolidation in the bank space, which has been almost non-existent, lower than it was during the financial crisis. So the financials are being viewed as a clear winner this morning.
Well, Paul and I are thinking about allocating to merger arbitrage. I mean, talk to us a little bit about antitrust regulation here in the U.S. I mean, can we expect that to lighten up under a Trump administration?
This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. First and foremost, at the antitrust regulators, I look at the FTC and Chair Lena Khan. Well, her term's actually already expired, but she gets to stay on as chair or as a commissioner in a Democratic majority until the president appoints and the Senate confirms her replacement. We'll be watching to see if she steps down and goes on to a different job. But in that case, it's still only a 2-2 tie. So Donald Trump is going to have to nominate someone to replace her and elevate maybe one of the existing FTC commissioners to chair before we have that change. At the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, Jonathan Cantor will be gone on January 20th at 12:01. How long does it take for Trump to make that change? That's something that we'll be watching. Who is his attorney general? That's something that we need to watch. That said, a lot of antitrust activity started when Donald Trump was president. The lawsuit against Google that we've been talking about in recent weeks, that's finally gotten to the point where we might see some action by the court to implement remedies. That was started under Donald Trump. So populism is driving antitrust. Populism drove Donald Trump. We will see some changes, but it's not as clear cut of a change as we discussed with financials.
Ed, markets have been looking to, for example, comments by Scott Bessent, ex-Soros, of, increasing domestic oil supply by 3 million oil equivalent barrels per day. People are looking at Elon Musk. I mean, who's going to be in Trump's cabinet here? I mean, is Scott Bessent really a candidate for U.S. Treasury Secretary? Is Elon Musk going to be running the Department of Transportation? I mean, talk to us a little bit about what we can expect in the weeks ahead on Trump's cabinet.
Yeah, so when I look at one of the bigger surprises of the election results was the size of the victory for Republicans in the Senate. And the more that Republicans pick up those seats, it could be a 55-seat majority when all is said and done from Republicans. The higher that is, the more Trump is going to be able to get anyone that he wants, and we wouldn't have to worry about one or two senators denying that nomination. Scott Bessent absolutely could be Treasury Secretary. There's others leading that role. I'm a little bit more skeptical as it comes to Elon Musk. To be a confirmed individual, you have to divest a lot from what you own. I just don't see that happening. The question I get a lot from Elon, too, is he going to drive all of these cuts? Call me skeptical of Congress actually passing significant budget cuts. We get asked that after every election, and our federal budget just continues to go up.
Ed, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate getting your perspectives. Ed Mills, he's a managing director and Washington policy analyst over there at Raymond James, joining us from New York via Zoom.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Damian Sassower sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. Donald Trump was elected the 47th president of the United States, pulling off a political comeback in one of the most polarized contests for the White House in U.S. history. While attending his supporters, he said this will truly be the golden age of America.
I will not rest until we have delivered the strong, safe, and prosperous America that our children deserve and that you deserve. This will truly be the golden age of America. This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again.
All right, that was President-elect Donald Trump addressing his supporters last evening. The question, I think, for the Democratic Party is, where does it go from here? Let's check in with Wendy Schiller, professor at Brown University and interim director of the Watson Institute, joining us from Providence, Rhode Island via Zoom. Wendy, we've had a few hours here to digest the news. If you're the Democratic Party, how deep do you really have to look inside the party to get a sense of what needs to be done?
Well, you have to ask yourself why, popular incumbent senators who have been reelected before, Sherrod Brown, Tammy Baldwin, Casey in Pennsylvania, could not withstand the red wave. And so you can attribute it to Trump charisma, the Trump followers. We can do that if we want to as observers. But, this ran deep. This reaction across voters, across different kinds of voters, from different backgrounds, different ages, this ran deep. And it was a signal that said, we don't like the policies that you're enacting. So what can they do? I think it's curious to go back to, or I'm sorry, not curious, informative to go back to Obama. Obama had a much stricter border policy than Joe Biden. And I think he did that because he sensed there wasn't enough support in America for something more liberal and more open. So you can say to yourselves, the Democrats closed the border far too late. The Democrats didn't push hard enough to get those interest rates down. The Democrats didn't pay attention to the price of eggs. And that's unusual for the Democrats, who usually care a lot about the price of eggs. So I think this is not necessarily a reboot completely, but they have got to meet the voter where the voter is. And last night, the voter was not with the Democratic Party.
Wendy, you mentioned the border, and let's look ahead here. Trump is about to embark on what many believe to be the largest deportation program in U.S. history. How does he expect to round them all up, and where does he intend to send them?
Well, Trump always surprises us in the sense that he'll sort of go off the ranch and then he'll kind of moderate. The idea is, how long does Trump want to be president? He's constitutionally prohibited from being elected and serving, not from running. And so, does he want to last a long time? Maybe get rid of the 22nd Amendment. I don't know what he plans, but I think he will scale this idea back, especially since the border has been shut down and, undocumented migration has slowed so much. Does he really have to do this? Does he have to disrupt the country this way? He could do some of it, but I don't think the pressure's on him to do all of it because Biden has already taken this step and he'll keep that policy in place.
Wendy, you mentioned the 22nd Amendment. You're not the first one today to talk about it, but what I'm most interested in, and John Tucker mentions, it's the Fed, right? And Trump has made no secret about his intention to have a greater say in monetary policy here in the U.S. My question for you is, what legal mechanisms can Trump take advantage of in order for to give the Oval Office more control, more say in monetary policy?
Well, Damian, the Federal Reserve Act, literally the act creating Federal Reserve and all the bills that have come, after that and reauthorizing it, that's something that's been sort of a partnership with private monetary institutions, banks, and the federal government. And the thing about Donald Trump is he's going to need cash, right? You can't crash the government and crash the economy by the federal government running out of cash. So there is a symbiotic relationship between really big banks and the Federal Reserve itself and the success of a president. So there's going to have to be negotiations there. But I don't think the heads of big banks are just going to hand over the keys to the kingdom to the president of the United States, no matter who they are. And so that will be a negotiation. And Trump fancies himself as a very good negotiator.
Wendy, does Kamala Harris have a future as a leader of the Democratic Party? I'm thinking maybe in 4 years' time.
I think all things considered, she ran a good campaign. What she was given, the time frame that she had to work within, and her balancing act of trying to separate from the Biden record and also present some sort of plan for the future and bringing in and solidifying particularly younger women, even older women. I think there's still a block in a constituency that she can tap if she wanted to run again. I just don't see this as a Kamala Harris failed campaign. I see it as Trump being a former president and energizing their base and not making the same campaign mistakes they did in 2020. And the Biden record, those numbers from exit polls yesterday on the wrong track. Those were extraordinarily high numbers, and I don't know if anybody could have won in the face of those numbers.
Wendy, I wonder if you could shift your attention here to what's going on in Ukraine. Obviously, Zelensky was the firebrand who rejected Trump's request for information on Hunter Biden's dealings back during his first tenure. And look, the battlefield's changing. Just yesterday, right, Ukrainian forces had their first run-in with North Korean troops in the Kursk region. What comes next for the Ukraine, for Zelensky, for Central Europe, and for Russia under a Trump administration?
Well, I think Trump is a fan of Putin, and I think Trump has said before that he thinks there's a deal that can be reached. So my guess is Trump says, listen, we're not going to send you the same kind of weaponry. We're not going to support you the same way. Go to the table, cut a deal, give up Crimea. Literally, these are the things that he'll say. And maybe we'll make sure that more of your people don't get killed. I think that's what we'll do. And in the Middle East, I think people who think that he'll be a diehard supporter of Israel, maybe. But he may go to the Saudis and say, what kind of deal do you want to cut to get this thing over with against Iran? He wants to make deals and be the hero. And that's something we've seen before and we'll see again. So whoever's dealing with him has to be able to give him some sort of victory he can walk away with.
Wendy, thank you so much. We appreciate that. As always, Wendy Schiller, Professor, Brown University, and Interim Director of the Watson Institute, joining us from Providence, Rhode Island.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live over YouTube as well, so check that out over there. The world is reacting, trying to make sense of kind of the political elections we held here last evening in the United States. New president, new Senate, and still to be determined a House of Representatives. So we're trying to talk to some smart people around the world about kind of the views of what might change going forward. Our next guest, Gautam Mukunda, he's a professor, a lecturer of management practice at the Yale School of Management. So, Gautam, a big surprise for a lot of people waking up this morning to find out that Donald Trump is the president-elect and that the Republicans have retaken the Senate here. What was your takeaway? What do you hear when you talk to people?
Hi, Paul. So first one is, if you were surprised, that kind of means you weren't paying attention, right? The polling was very clear. This could go either way. Maybe you're surprised by the magnitude of Trump's victory, but this was a 50-50 election going in, and 50-50 elections have to get resolved one way or the other. For what's going to happen next, I think there are some things you can kind of bet on. It looks at this point increasingly likely that Republicans are going to take the House of Representatives too. If you have Republicans in the House, the Senate, and the presidency, you can expect a tax cut. It'll be almost certainly a deficit finance tax cut, because that's what always happens. Second, I think Trump has committed himself to tariffs in a way that I suspect he's not likely to back off from right away. But once he does that, you're going to see economic impacts within the United States. You're going to see retaliatory tariffs. Like, the way in which that trade struggle escalates is going to shape the political dynamic going forward in ways that we can't predict right now, because we just don't know what the reactions are going to be. That's all domestic policy. On foreign policy, I think we can pretty quickly get some insight. And there, I would be really concerned. If I were the Ukrainians, I'm not sure Ukraine's position is tenable anymore. They will essentially have to rely on Western Europe to supply them for their defense. I just don't know that that's within Western Europe's industrial capacity. And for my friends in Ukraine, I don't know what to say to them right now. And second, the basic underpinning of international politics since the Second World War has been that a lot of different countries were willing to bet their survival on the reliability of the United States as an ally. That is not an overstatement. North Korea has nuclear weapons, and they do not have nuclear weapons. Japan has China not too far away that has nuclear weapons. They do not have nuclear weapons. They have said that we trust the United States so much to protect us that we are willing to risk our national survival on that. If you are you are part of the defense establishment in South Korea or Japan, I don't see how you make that bet anymore. I don't see how you could possibly do that, given Trump's expressed beliefs about alliances. And in that situation, I would suspect both significant increase in defense spending and, right now, I'm sure they're having meetings about whether they need to acquire a nuclear neutron.
Gautam, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the timeline between now and when Trump is expected to announce some of his cabinet picks. I mean, any color there?
So we'll find out a lot more, because the cabinet picks will determine, a huge amount of what happens next. Democrats were obviously deeply concerned by rumors that, Steve Bannon and Michael Flynn and Stephen Miller would have very, very senior roles in the Trump administration in shaping its policy. But it's also possible that we'll get the second-term version of Steve Mnuchin and Jim Mattis and people like that. And I know when you talk to people, very senior people in the financial sector, their expectation is that some of their peers will go into this administration and act in the same way that they did in the last one. Which one of those happens is entirely up to Trump. And my guess is what we'll start to see is, if we look at the people around him, the way I would say is they're all ambitious and they don't play well with others. That would be a characteristic that describes a lot of these people. And so I think we're likely to see some really intensive, what you might call court politics. I was just telling a bunch of students earlier today that if you want to understand what's going to happen next, you need to go back and read histories of the Byzantine Empire, because that's kind of what we're thinking about, is lots and lots of different people struggling to capture the ear of the king and to get his support for what they want to do and for their own strength and power. And given what we've seen about Trump and how fast he goes through staff, we might see that shifting from moment to moment. Because if you look at sort of what Stephen Miller wants to do and what, say, Elon Musk wants to do, there's not a lot of overlap between those two.
Gautam, talk to us about the idea of checks and balances here. Trump in the White House, Republican Senate, perhaps a Republican-led House. Is it up to the Supreme Court to act as a final check on a presidency? Because there are some concerns that how the Supreme Court has evolved over the last several years, that even that may not be an effective check.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, it'll be the Supreme Court because there's no one else, especially if Republicans take the House. That'll just for the next 2 years, there will be no center of power significant enough to stand up to the White House. And I agree with you. The Supreme Court has made a series of rulings that no major legal scholar would have predicted, giving sort of the Trump presidency at levels of authority that are unprecedented in American history. But the other half of that I'll say is 2 years is not that long. And American politics is deeply reactive. Political scientists refer to it as thermostatic. Basically, whatever the president does, the average American starts to oppose it. And so we might, 10 years later, maybe they support it. The classic example of that is Obamacare, where when Barack Obama passed it, it cost him an enormous landslide defeat in the next set of elections. But 10 years later, it's actually quite popular. So what we should expect is whatever Trump does, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, everything we know about political science says that the average American is going to disapprove, because that's just how Americans respond to change. If that is strong enough, then you'll see the House switch sides again in 2026, and then might start to see some real checks and balances. But for the next 24 months, I expect him to have essentially a free hand.
All right, Gautam, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Gautam Mukunda, professor, lecturer of management practice at the Yale School of Management up in New Haven.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Let's see about policy, because a lot of changes to be expected from global policy here in the Trump administration, particularly one where it also has a Republican in the Senate as well in the leadership roles. Monica Guerra joins us, executive director and the head of U.S. policy for Morgan Stanley Wealth Management. Monica, thanks so much for joining us here. I see huge political news over last evening and into this morning. How do you frame that out for your Morgan Stanley Wealth Management customers as it relates to their portfolios?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the things that, we are really focusing on is, what does the president have control over, especially since we don't have the full outcome on Congress. So that's what we're talking about right now. And what we see is trade, tariffs, and energy policy really being the most sensitive to President-elect Trump's second term. So, for example, you could have higher tariffs on China and a potential universal tariff, and those could, potentially negatively drag on growth and boost inflation in the short term. But, we're also focusing on some of the other, fact winners that could come out of, his executive branch.
Drill, baby, drill. I mean, Monica, talk to us a little bit about what we're seeing in the commodity complex here. I mean, I see it off 1.5% year to date. It was just up a few weeks ago. You would think maybe perhaps with some of the policies that Trump is floating here on the energy sector, certainly, minerals that are hard to get, et cetera, that we would see something bounce back here. But it seems like things are kind of rolling over. Curious to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, and the Department of Energy, that's a great example of where Trump has a lot of control to act unilaterally. On the drilling side, we don't see that really impacting the market positively, because more supply could put pressure on pricing if you're thinking about from the market's perspective. That said, if we're thinking about energy broadly inclusive of, say, a clean energy agenda, there's a real risk there to clean energy from a policy perspective, from a rollback in potential Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. But one of the things we want to highlight here on clean energy is that even though you could have sort of a deconstructive approach to tax credits, clean energy policy, et cetera, what you're really focusing on here is rates, the rate environment. Clean energy as an industry functions like growth stocks. And so when rates are low, and markets right now are currently pricing in 4 cuts through the end of 2026, essentially clean energy can outperform. And so that's what we're focusing on in the energy sector, is that while from a policy perspective, you don't see much movement on traditional, you could see movement sort of negatively placing a drag on clean energy. The real story is the rate story on clean energy.
So I'm looking at the VIX here, as my colleague Paul Sweeney, rightly points out. We're back down to 16, off 22% day over day. Off nearly a third since the 4th, since Monday. Talk to us a little bit about expectations for volatility under a Trump regime. I remember during his first term, it was jump risk, right? It was, one day he says something, his left leg is feeling one thing, and all of a sudden he says it, and the markets kind of react to that. We've been in an environment for the better part of the last 4 years, Monica, where it's been all about rate differentials, all about monetary policies, all about the Fed. Is there any chance that the Fed, rate differentials can retake control of the market narrative here, or are we just in Trump's world and everyone's just living in it?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the drop off in the VIX that we're seeing, that's just par for the course with normal election year activity. Once you have the president set, you have a sense of what's happening with Congress. Granted, we don't really know what's happening with the House. Volatility plummets. Yes, you're going to see headline response. One of the sort of murky areas around Trump is, which Trump are we going to get? Does that mean that we get more disruption, or is it really a story all about Congress and what they do with taxes? In that case, if it's focused on taxes, things are likely to remain more stable, especially as we watch the play-by-play as they debate each provision under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You could get an extension of most of it, but what's important here is that even if you have that a shallow red wave in the House and you have that unified government, those thin margins mean that there's still room for the GOP to play. So we are going to be watching that for a while, and I think that, yes, Trump is the disruption president, right? And we're thinking about headline reaction, volatility that's short-lived. But over the long run, what we're all going to be focusing on is that tax agenda and what happens in Congress.
All right, Monica, thanks so much for joining us. Monica Guerra, Executive Director and Head of U.S. Policy for Morgan Stanley Wealth Management.
This is the Bloomberg Intelligence Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.